Taoiseach, I do not think anyone was surprised by the failures of your government's housing policy laid out in last week's report on the Housing Commission. I see those failures every day in my constituency office, people struggling to pay rent, to find a home, people stuck in the housing list 16 to 18 years, people stuck in homelessness. The desperation out there is a direct result, to my opinion, of the housing policies implemented by Fianna Fáil and Fine Gael, supported by Labour and the Greens for decades, not for 10 years like your Minister made a point earlier on, but not by 50 years failed policy. The report calls for an increase of our social housing stock to 20% of all housing stock. We used to have over 20% of social housing stock. We built tens of thousands of homes when this country was practically broke. The report is calling for a return to what we had before your party decided to turn our housing policy into a failed policy to allow the big banks and developers to make profit and not providing homes for ordinary people. Nowhere is this failure clearer than in the rental sector. Average rents have more than doubled from 2012 to 2022. And I can assure you, Taoiseach, wages did not double in that time. You stood by and allowed rents to eat more and more into people's pay packets and more into people's standard of living. And what do people get for up to $2,500 rent or more a month? A rental sector where housing standards are not properly inspected, rent controls that, according even to the Housing Commission, are not properly enforced, a clear lack of security of tenure in which you fulfil all your obligations as a tenant and can still be turfed out, and a serious lack of protections from illegal evictions which have become endemic in our rental sector. The Housing Commission has clear recommendations for the rental sector, and I want to focus on one, Taoiseach, that is facilitating sales of rental properties with tenants in situ. Quoting from section 6 of the report, to facilitate sales with tenants in situ, the rent regulations need to be reformed as rental evaluations, which will be an important component in valuing the overall selling price of a property. In addition, mortgages for the purchase of private rented dwellings would need to allow purchases with tenants in situ. This is a clear solution to one of the biggest problems that faces renters, the lack of security of tenure, and it would go a long way into ending no-fault evictions and securing renters in their homes. This is standard for commercial property. If it is good enough for businesses, it should be good enough for people's homes. I would go further and say that there should be no evictions ever because of sale of a property. That's in my party's housing policy. Will the government follow the recommendations of the Housing Commission and facilitate sales of rental properties with tenants in situ? That is the question I'm asking.
First of all, we have a very extensive tenant in situ programme, and it's been very effective.
Not according to the Commission.
It's been very effective, and Minister Darabine introduced that well over, I suppose, nearly 2 years at this stage now, and it's been very successful and effective. In terms of preventing evictions and giving the option or going to the seller in this case and saying the council will buy the house and enable the person to continue on as a tenant of the council onwards, and it's been very effective. I think it's maybe potentially up to 1,800. I get the most up-to-date figure that have been approved so far. The key, and by the way, the government appointed the Housing Commission and tasked them with examining long-term housing policy. And of the 83 recommendations, 65 are already advanced or at varying stages of implementation, with some more advanced than others, and comprehensive consideration is being given to the recommendations. I'm not sure whether you agree with the recommendations of the Housing Commission in respect of the rental market in terms of maybe changing the RPZs and moving to a different system in terms of reference areas. I think there would be some complexity to that, but we will examine that because it's the government working with many in the Oireachtas who pushed for the RPZ system, which it seems that the Housing Commission has described as reactive. So the political system, not just government, has been very anxious to intervene in the rental market on an ongoing basis. On a preliminary reading, it seems to me that the Housing Commission is reflecting on that and suggesting that maybe the Oireachtas should be less reactive. But that's a debate now that we'll have in the House. Because whereas everyone has kind of focused on the highlight opening sort of chapter of the Housing Commission, there's been precious little confirmation from anyone in the House as to do they agree specifically with aspects of the Housing Commission's report, particularly in respect of the rental market. And I would be interested in parties opposite to come forward with substantive views on what, in terms of the substance of some of the recommendations themselves, particularly in terms of the rental market. In terms of the Social Housing Act, for example, that's not something that's going to happen overnight. One would have to examine again in detail, because it's a comprehensive report, what is envisaged. I note that my understanding is the Housing Commission don't believe that tenants of local authority housing should have the right to buy tenant purchase, for example. And the reasons advanced to that is that they want to increase forever the existing housing stock within by local authorities. Now, the system currently, I think we have about 50% of new builds in social housing is built by approved social housing bodies who don't allow for tenant purchase. But I'm not clear if there's consensus within the Oireachtas that tenant purchase should be ruled out completely.
Thank you,
again, we'll examine that, and I'm sure there's nuances within the report in the Commission as well. And it does deserve comprehensive examination.
Thank you. Dr. Collins.
Taoiseach, thanks for your reply, but didn't answer my question. The situation in Ireland is that 5,000 people have entered emergency accommodation since the ban on no-fault evictions was lifted last year. Terminations rose by 20% after the ban was lifted. More than 19,000 households issued with eviction notices last year. We have record homelessness. More than 100 families in Ireland became homeless in the last 3 months of 2023 due to no-fault evictions. And for 63% of eviction notices last year, the reason given was sale of the property. So the Housing Commission is making a point here that that should not be the case. Focus Ireland called this the evict to sell crisis. So what the Housing Commission is raising here is that no, you shouldn't be forced to leave that house for the sale of the home. Like in commercial businesses, I've seen apartments above businesses and they sell with the person in situ. So that's what they're raising here from that point of view. And I'm asking this government, do you support that? There should be no fault evictions for people who are actually paying their rent, keeping the house up to standards, and then a landlord decides they want to sell and get rid of those tenants out of the house. And that has to change, and that's what the Housing Commission are referring to here. That was the question I was asking.
Well, it seems to me, I don't think they're recommending no fault eviction. No, the Housing Commission is not. No, they're not saying that here. They're saying regulate market rents fairly and effectively by reforming the current system of rent regulation and establishing a system of reference rents. And this reform should be informed by evidence-based reviews on the impact of regulated market rents on rented housing supply, accessibility and affordability. And such reviews should be conducted on a regular basis. Reform and consolidate standards for rented dwelling through a single nationwide dwelling standards. That's fine. Amend the standards for rental accommodation and private cost rental homes. Regulate the landlord functions of local authority-owned dwellings, formalise the local authority-tenant relations, and implement reforms to ensure a more effective enforcement model. That's all fine. And so it is, yeah. And I've gone through the rental, but I don't see any reference to a ban on no-fault evictions. It seems to me that they want a significant reform of the existing rental market regulation. And I think that's going to take a significant degree of work. Meanwhile, the government is absolutely committed to the tenant in situ scheme, as we have demonstrated in terms of buying houses where people are at risk of eviction, going to the council and saying, council, you buy the house and keep the person in the house.
Thank you.